Hello, I'm August Hoppe, President of Hoppe Tree Service, and I'm excited to kick off our winter webinar series tonight. We're doing our first discussion is going to be about pruning. So we're going to be talking about pruning with confidence and going over a lot of the techniques that we use for pruning. So hopefully that you can have a little more knowledge and gain that confidence when you're out in your yards doing your pruning. We also have a couple other webinars we're going to be doing this year. We have another one coming up in February, and it's about some of the common insects and diseases that we see on our landscape trees. So that's a really valuable one to come and listen to, and you'll be able to understand what things are serious pests and which ones are more just cosmetic issues for trees. So I can take a lot of worry out of people's minds if they can understand some of those things. So that's in February. And then in March, our last webinar is going to be about the top trees for 2023. So we've been doing more and more planting as a company. We're really excited about that. We love the idea of planting more trees for people, but we continue to see the wrong trees being planted, trees that are prone to disease or put in the wrong spots. So as arborists, we know a lot about trees, and we'd love to be able to help you with your planting to get that proper tree in the right place. And we're going to go over some of our favorite trees, some trees that are really resilient, can tolerate our soil conditions. So if you're thinking about planting something next year, that would be a really good webinar to listen in on. So with that being said, we're going to kick it off. I'm going to share the screen and get my PowerPoint going. And today's talk is ornamental pruning and tree care. So here we go. Trees are like water balloons. The idea is that when you're pruning, you are going to be controlling where the growth goes. So if you take a tree and you cut the top down, it's going to encourage the sides to grow. Same thing like a water balloon. As you push that water balloon down from the top, it expands out on the sides. So kind of think of your tree canopy as that water balloon. If you prune the sides in, it can encourage the top to grow. There's many reasons for that. We'll kind of go into that as we get through the presentation today as well. So I always like that idea of the water balloon effect. We need to really understand our types of pruning cuts that we make. So a branch removal cut it's a simple cut. It's where you're taking a lateral branch and you're cutting it off to the main trunk of the tree. Notice in this diagram that we are leaving what we call the branch collar. That's this area right in there. We don't want to cut that tissue flush against the trunk because the tree needs that tissue there to grow over the pruning cut that we make. These removal cuts, they're just outside the branch collar, they're back to a parent branch, and we use those when we're going to be cutting off dead branches or rubbing or crisscrossing branches. A lot of times when we call it a crown cleaning, where we're doing a healthy pruning of the interior branches of the tree, where we're cutting off the dead stuff, the rubbing, and water sprout or sucker branches. Those are removal cuts. You're simply removing the branch back to its main stem. The other type of cuts that we like to make are called reduction cuts, and reduction cuts are going to reduce the size of a limb. So instead of cutting that whole limb off back to the parent stem, we're reducing the limb. There's many reasons why we would want to make that type of cut. We might be wanting to just manage the size of the tree, make it a smaller tree or shrub, or maybe we're looking to reduce weight on the ends of the limbs so that they're not as heavy on the ends of the limbs. So we really lighten the weight of the limb. So reduction cuts are important cuts for us to do that sort of thing as well. And then the third type of cut is a heading cut. A heading cut is where it's usually a smaller diameter cut, and it's not back to a lateral branch. It's kind of just at a indiscriminate place on the branch. Maybe you're doing it to kind of shape a tree like a crabapple tree where you don't have necessarily a great lateral branch to cut back to, but in order to keep the form of the plant, you make a heading cut. So that's one of those cuts that's going to be between two lateral branches, and often it might leave a small stub. And it's important when you're making heading cuts that they're relatively small diameter cuts. We don't like to make those cuts with large diameter things. So when I say small diameter, I'm thinking 2 inches or less, typically, even smaller, preferably. Why would we make a heading cut? Well, you know, we're doing that to reduce that branch, to control the size of it, to kind of direct the growth of the plant. So remember what I said, if you cut from the top, you cut the top of the tree down, you can encourage the side branches to grow. Another reason we do that is oftentimes we don't want to prune too much out of a tree. So we want to really control the dosage of the pruning that we're doing. So let's say we've made removal cuts, we've made reduction cuts, and we still need to make some more cuts to put the, you know, give the tree some better form. And we don't want to cut too much of the foliage off. That's when we make some heading cuts. It allows us to do a little less pruning, and we don't have to be quite as aggressive then. There can be some repercussions with heading cuts. If they are larger cuts, often you'll see sprouts grow from those areas. And that's why we try to do reduction cuts if we can, or removal cuts, because we don't get as many water sprouts or suckers from those type of cuts. But there is a place for heading cuts when we need them. When you're making a cut, especially a branch that has some weight on it, it's important to think about the 3-cut method to remove the branch. If you were to simply just cut the branch from the top down with one cut near the base of the stem here, like where I'm showing with my mouse here, that branch, as it starts falling down, it will peel. It won't sever completely, and so that branch will start peeling down, and often it rips and it tears and it causes a damage to the tree. Oh, I'm sorry, I went too fast there. It causes damage to the trunk of the tree. As that rips, it creates more surface area. So we want to avoid those type of cuts. So what we do is we make an undercut a little further out on this stem. You know, typically it's going to be 3 or 4 inches out from the trunk of the tree. That's cut number 1, and then cut number 2 comes from the top completely down. And as that branch starts to fall down, it severs completely with cut number 1, and then the branch falls completely, and you don't have a tear. You don't have the tear, that ripping effect. You're left with a small stub then, and then you make your finishing cut, which is cut number 3. So that's the best method to do a larger limb. Sometimes with smaller branches, you may want to just cut with your hand pruners and hold the branch as you're making the cut so that it doesn't tear and peel. So that's something you definitely can do. Maybe if you're using a handsaw or hand pruners, that's a very good method to do. In the springtime or in the fall, trees are more sensitive. Their xylem and phloem is moving, and the trees are more active, so the tissue tends to tear more, especially right at kind of bud break, when the buds are and the leaves are first starting to come out on the tree, or sometimes in the fall as well, as they're moving the energy from the leaves back into the root system. The tree, the xylem and phloem are very active, so you need to be more careful than ever at those periods of time to avoid the tearing. Another type of cut we make is a codominant stem pruning cut. So this is where you have 2 stems of equal size growing together, and they don't really have a branch collar. So it's a little harder to understand or decide where to make the cut. So ideally, what you're doing is you're making the cut at about a 45-degree angle. You can see here, this is a honey locust. And you have, this is called the branch collar ridge, and that is kind of bisecting where the 2 limbs, where you want to come at about a 45-degree angle, and you want to make that cut there. That gives you the least amount of surface area. That's important because the less surface area, the more easily that tree is going to grow over that pruning cut. You can see on the picture on the right what those 2 limbs look like. The reason we would want to make a cut like that is we want to avoid having codominant stems in the first place. A tree with a single leader is a much stronger tree than one with two stems of equal size. As this tree were to grow, those 2 stems are going to grow and fuse together, and in the center there, it won't be solid wood. It will be a point of pressure as those 2 limbs have pushed on each other, and that's going to be a weak point in the tree, and a big storm could come and rip one of those sides of the tree off, one of those stems off, because of that. And we see that all the time. Every time we have a major storm in our area, we see lots of failures from these codominant stems. So one of our best defenses against that is to prune the trees when they're young, and prune them often, and remove those codominant stems. Another type cut is when we have this included bark situation where you have a very narrow angle of attachment. That's another area of weakness in a tree when you have these two stems growing together. This is very similar to that codominant stem situation where I was talking about, where there's the pressure between the two branches growing together. That's happening with a cut like this too. It makes it a little harder for you to understand where to make the cut on something like this, but you have to kind of imagine where a branch collar ridge would be and then make your cut at about 45 degrees from that. And the idea, I think, to really think about is to make the cut with the least amount of surface area and not leave a stub on the tree. You can see if you were to make the cut on the higher up here, you know, it would have a minimal amount of surface area, but it would leave a stub. And a stub is something that's going to have decay can set in there. Also, you can have, you know, that's going to be an area where the water sprouts and sucker branches are definitely going to be able to sprout from there. If you were to make that cut on the bottom here, that's going to be much more surface area. It's going to be too close to the trunk of the tree. The idea there is that you're going to have the tree is going to be more prone to decay closer to the trunk from a cut like that. So the yes area right here in the middle is definitely the sweet spot and the place you'd like to make that cut. Natural pruning, crown reduction pruning is one of our favorite pastimes. We do a lot of this sort of work to shorten the height of trees. Generally, we're doing it on smaller trees like the flowering crab trees that are, or maybe Japanese maples, ornamental trees that are close to the house or close to the, you know, prominent trees in the landscape that are designed to be smaller trees, but as we know, trees continue to grow. So some of these trees that were designed to be small get larger than people had hoped. So we control their size with these crown reduction cuts. And for larger trees, when we do this, it's usually a function of safety. We're trying to avoid the risk of the tree failing. If we can make the canopy shorter, it has less of a sail effect and less stress on those limbs. So this is a beech tree. You can see in this picture here that the top was brought down maybe 15% or so, and that tree is going to not bear the brunt of the winds as much. So that tree's in a stronger position now. You can see with this photo on the right where we're making these cuts and we're reducing the size of the limbs. All these reduction cuts are going back to lateral branches. So none of these are those heading cuts that we talked about that generally are leaving stubs. These are reduction cuts right back to the lateral branch. Here's another example of reduction cuts. You can see on the right, this is a juniper. We're bringing down the height. A lot of times when you're trying to shape a juniper, bring it back to a manageable size, you're going to cut off some of those longer ends. Sometimes I call those wild ends. You can do it in a very natural way where you're kind of grabbing each of those, cutting each of those longer ends and cutting back to a lateral branch. It may be a small lateral branch, but it's something that the tree, you know, the juniper is going to be able to grow from that point because you've cut it to a lateral branch. It'll look natural. It'll look good. On the left, we have a tree here, and here we had a codominant situation going on, and rather than remove this limb entirely and make that removal cut, the reduction cut was chosen to do. There could be a variety of reasons for that. The reduction cut has slowed the growth of this branch, making this central leader stronger and definitely the dominant branch in the tree. So this one will grow, the center limb will grow faster now. The one on the right that has been shortened, probably about like 50% or so, that will slow down its growth. This will become a subordinate branch now. And this will start getting thinner as the main stem gets larger, and this will be more of a normal branch. This could have been done for aesthetic reasons where it was a reduction cut was made. We didn't want to leave a hole in that side of the tree. We didn't want to overexpose the tree to having too much pruning done to it. Sometimes we can do a reduction cut now, and then as we come back to that tree in a couple of years, we maybe then remove the entire limb. We don't want to shock a tree by pruning too much. Typical rule of thumb is we don't want to take more than 30% of the foliage off of a tree. Each one of those leaves is a food factory for your tree or shrub. So the more leaves we take off, the less photosynthesis the tree can do. So we want to think of that judiciously as we're pruning.
Raising of the crown is another common practice that we do. A lot of times those lower limbs, they will have a lot of stress on them. Some of the lower limbs, especially in a situation where a tree's growing in full sun, those limbs really spread outwards. They capture lots of sunlight. They don't have competition of other trees around them, so they grow wide. And some of those lower limbs can have a lot of weight on them, and those can be more prone to breaking. So sometimes we remove those branches or cut portions of those limbs off. And that can help with the structure of the tree, make the tree stronger. Otherwise, a lot of times we're raising up trees just so that there's more light to the landscape or garden underneath it, or maybe it's near the street or a driveway. We need to get delivery trucks underneath the tree for a variety of reasons, to raise up the crown of the tree, to make a uniform look with your trees. Generally, let's get this right. Generally, it's going to be about 1/3 of the canopy is about as high up as you'd want to go with crown raising. I've seen a lot of situations where people really brought their trees up heavily, very aggressively, and you lose a lot of that natural character of the tree when you do that, and it's not going to be healthy for the tree. You can accomplish a lot by not, like I mentioned, not cutting those big limbs back to the trunk per se, but cutting the lower parts of them off. You have less surface area when you do that. So if you were to cut a big limb back to the trunk, it might be a 6 or 8 inch diameter cut on there, and it's going to be very hard for the tree to grow over that. So if you can get that limb shorter and you can raise up the height by taking lower parts of it off, maybe you can make 3 or 4 cuts on the outer ends of that big limb, on the downward parts of that limb, you can have much less surface area. The tree can grow over those pruning cuts much more rapidly, and you can still accomplish your goal of getting that tree up, getting more light in the area, having it a more open situation. So more smaller cuts is definitely better than one big cut. Here's a good image of crown cleaning. This is, like I said, something that we do quite a bit. We're pruning the tree to create a good strong structure to it. Often that means thinning out the canopy of rubbing branches, dead branches, broken branches, water sprouts, things like that. We're pruning so that the tree can be healthy when we do that. The idea is that we're looking at what we call scaffold branches of the tree. Those are the main permanent limbs of the tree. We want them to kind of alternate back and forth along the trunk of the tree. And then we want to end up, removing branches that are going to be interfering with those scaffold branches of the tree. So crown cleanings, when they're done, they look very good. They look natural. They're healthy for the tree. Probably our favorite type of pruning. When you are pruning the tree, we really want to stress the idea of not over thinning the tree. You can see by my pictures here, we have, the one on the left was that thick tree that definitely needs some pruning. Line tailing is overdoing it. You can see how hollowed out the tree is in the center. What ends up happening, since all those cuts were made in the center, the tree just continues to grow outwards, and those branches, these big longer branches, tend to just grow on the ends, and then those limbs get droopy, and then they're more prone to breakage. So you can see, like in a windstorm, limbs like this are going to move much more they're going to go back and forth tremendously in a storm and put a lot more shock on the tree. So when you're pruning, you really want to make staggered cuts throughout the canopy of the tree. You can see with the correct image there, cuts are made the length of the limb from the inside of the tree and to the outside of the tree to open it up, to protect those scaffold branches. You can see what I'm talking about pretty clearly here as far as what the scaffold branches are, these main permanent branches. They alternate up the trunk, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They're well spaced out in the tree. And then we're removing branches that are going to interfere with those. But we're going throughout the canopy of the tree to do that. We're not just in the center of the tree thinning things out. There's kind of a misnomer, I think, that a lot of people feel that if you thin a tree out very aggressively, you'll get better airflow and the tree will be safer in a storm. If you overdo that thinning, you're going to be creating the complete opposite of that. You're just going to have the limb bouncing back and forth at the tips, causing lots of trouble. So these are some of our common pruning methods that we do. We've talked about the crown cleaning, what that looks like. It's a natural pruning. A crown thinning is going to be a little more aggressive than a crown cleaning. A crown thinning is really going to have much more of a purpose to kind of create better airflow through the tree and more sunlight. We will do that for a couple reasons. One is for disease prevention. We do have quite a few trees that are susceptible to fungus diseases, and fungus diseases like cool, moist areas. So if you thin the canopy, you can get better sunlight and circulation through the tree, and the tree can dry out faster. And so funguses won't be as prevalent. We can do this with crabapple trees. We do it with some spruce trees. Things like that. Other reasons you might do crown thinning is because you have some key areas in your yard that you want to bring more sunlight to. It might be the lawn or garden underneath it. There might be an adjacent tree that you want to make sure has more of a chance to grow and flourish. So if you thin out a certain tree, you get that light in there. That is certainly an acceptable reason to do the crown thinning as well. We talked about the crown raising. You can see that's about 1/3 of the canopy that was lifted off of that tree that give it a better, stronger structure, more upright habit. And then the crown reduction. That's where we're making those cuts back to those lateral branches. We're shortening the height of the tree. We're keeping it manageable. We're reducing the sail effect of wind when we do that. Clearance pruning. Clearance pruning is something we do quite a bit of. A lot of trees are planted very close to the house. We really like to kind of specify what we're going to do. Think about the distance of clearance that you need. Branches can grow over the roof, of a house. A lot of people, I think, feel like they need trees really cut very aggressively away from their roofs. And I don't think that's always the case. Matter of fact, sometimes if you cut too much away from the tree, too much of the tree away from the roof, you're creating more of a safety risk. You can imagine a tree that you have cut lots of limbs off of it, and if it were to fail in a storm, all of a sudden, there's much more space and momentum for that tree to gather. If the main stem of that tree were to break and it was going to fall towards the roof, much more momentum now. So we do typically like to leave branches that grow over the roof. We do want to have acceptable amount of clearance. For smaller trees, it might be 3 to 4 feet of clearance. For larger trees, it might be 10 feet or maybe even 20 feet of clearance from the roof. Each tree is kind of different. Each tree kind of shows you through its structure how much clearance is a good amount of clearance. We like to look at the limbs. We like to look at how they're attached to the tree to make sure they're in a strong situation to help determine that. So definitely an arborist can help you with understanding the proper amount of clearance. Roofs don't like to be on constant shade. You get moss and mildew that grows on shingles. It can shorten the life of your roof if it's excessively shady, but there's definitely a happy median in there. Sometimes we'll make removal cuts where we're cutting back to the main stem, but often we'll do reduction cuts over a roof so that we can shorten the limb, create the clearance we want without over pruning the tree. Now we're going to talk about shrubs a little bit. This is something that a lot of people have questions about. There's a lot of different ways to prune shrubs. One of the simplest ways is a rejuvenation pruning. That's where you're literally just cutting the shrub down to the ground and allowing it to regrow. This one is definitely an easier method to think about. You usually cut it about 3 or 4 inches off the ground, and then you'll see that new growth come right back up. We'll often use this rejuvenation pruning for multi-stem shrubs, maybe ones that are like really overgrown and it feels like it's almost impossible to prune them correctly because they're like half dead and just have really terrible structure. It's almost kind of like where you're going to press the nuclear option and just do a whole reset for the plant. Cut it low to the ground, allow it to regrow. You'll usually see, easily 2 to 3 feet of growth in the first year coming back, you know, if the shrub was in pretty good health to begin with. Some of our plants that are really struggling, you know, there may be a question on how well they will grow back up from a rejuvenation pruning. But sometimes you don't have a lot to lose when you're doing that with a very stressed or diseased plant. So that rejuvenation pruning, very common. I think of honeysuckles. I think of some lilacs. That's a common way to do that. Another way we can do our multi-stem shrubs where we're not being that dramatic, where we're not cutting it down to the ground, is to really thin them out, thin out some of those stems. A lot of good things can happen when we do that. We do a combination of removal cuts and reduction cuts with multi-stem shrubs. And the concept to think about is wherever you make those cuts is where you're going to see growth develop in the tree. So if you've got, you know, 15 main stems on the shrub, and then you take 5 of those out, you're going to thin out the plant. Those remaining stems are going to get more sunlight. They're going to have a little more space to grow. They're going to be more productive when you do that. And also you will have new growth come up from the base where those old cuts were. So you'll have a plant that kind of constantly refills itself. A lot of problems people have with their shrubs is they tend to just cut on the top ends of the shrubs and not really in the center of the plant. So what ends up happening is all the growth is at the top, and that's where the only place the flowers are. And then the center of the tree generally over time just declines away. It gets thick and there's a lot of competition for growth, and things just die out. And then you might be left with a plant that only has 3 main stems to it. And at that point, you have a really hard time trying to bring that back into a natural, nice form and a healthier look, because if you were to remove one of those main stems, it just would ruin the whole look and aesthetics of the plant. So prune shrubs often and prune them when they're young and thin them out. Many shrubs can really grow back quite well. I think of dogwoods. You can pretty much constantly always be pruning on a red stem dogwood. Some of our lilacs are like that too, just very vigorous growers. So don't be afraid of cutting those back. And I've got some images I'll show you of some of our examples of that too. You know, this whole type of pruning, we call it a renewal pruning. You know, it's really that selective removal of older stems to allow for better regrowth. So you can see on this shrub here, looks like it, you know, could easily be a lilac, where we've got, you know, 1, 2, 3, or 4 of these older stems. They're woodier than the others. Their blossoms aren't as strong as the other ones. The leaves might be a little smaller. You can see what it can look like if you were to cut those low to the ground. Look at the after picture. It looks like a brand new bush. It's all new growth, better growth. There's room for sunlight to get in there. There'll be more growth in the base of the plant, in the center of the plant. It won't be leggy. So it's a very good way to think about pruning. Here's another example, multiple stems here. You can really take a lot out and make, you know, and step back and look, and it doesn't look like it was done all that aggressive, but you look on the ground next to you and you've got a huge area of brush or branches that you've cut. So if done properly, it can really have a nice aesthetic to it. Here's another example where we're doing a combination of these removal cuts and these reduction cuts. So we've definitely taken a lot out of this plant here. Rubbing and crisscrossing stems are definitely good ones to remove because as those rub together, they weaken each other. They become a point of insect and disease issues. So we take out some of those stems all the way down to the ground. You will get regrowth that occurs right in here at the base of the plant as that plant continues to regrow. But also, you know, we've made reduction cuts in here. We've cut some of the tip branches off. We've reduced the, you know, crazy form of the plant. The wild ends we've cut back. We've created a nice shape. We've consolidated the plant, and that is definitely a very healthy type of plant pruning to do. So that's a thinning and a shaping is a common way to look at it. We like to do the thinning first and then come back and do the shaping. So the thinning is removal cuts, the shaping is the reduction cuts. And occasionally we'll make some heading cuts on here too, because if we don't have a really great place to make our reduction cut to, we'll do a heading cut, and that's okay. You're reducing the dosage of pruning on the plant and you're keeping it in a good form. So here's another example of that, thinning and reduction cuts. A lot of times we'll like to cut some of the side branches off. So, you know, if you can imagine, a lot of our large old shrubs, those outer limbs, those outer stems tend to bend and kind of start growing horizontally, and the shrub really takes up a big footprint. So we can make the shrub more upright and get all those benefits of those good removal cuts, those thinnings at the base of the plant, and get that regrowth from the base and shorten the footprint to make the footprint of the shrub smaller. So it's like a two for one advantage there by doing that. Heading cuts back to lateral buds. So when you don't have a very good spot to cut back to with for a lateral branch, you can, the next best thing is when you're making those heading cuts, try to cut it next to a bud. You'll notice on the stems where buds are developing, try to cut back to those. You can see the cuts at a slant, you know, it's about a 45-degree angle there. That reduces the suckering effect that occurs when you do that. So you can control the size by doing that as well. Some of our more flexible stem plants, I think like potentilias or spireas, you can do the same kind of thing. They can be awfully thick and it might be hard to follow, you know, these stems all the way down to the base, but you should be able to get in there with a hand pruner. Get that hand pruner down deep into the base of the plant, select a stem, clip it out, and then you've created more airspace in there. You've created more area for the sunlight to get down into, and and better airflow and a more productive plant. So it's the same concept as those woodier, bigger shrubs, but maybe a little harder to do a little more meticulous work because it can be a challenge to locate those stems, but oftentimes, you know, it doesn't matter which stem you take as long as you're taking a stem out. So think about that as you explore that option with those smaller potentilias and spireas and plants like that. So here's another example of what it kind of looks like with a before picture on the left here, and then we've begun the thinning process. We've taken out you know, some of the stems. Afterwards, as it's thinned out, you have this kind of look to it. What we want you to not do is just do this indiscriminate rounding over, shaping over the top of it. What we'd like to rather see is some of those reduction cuts, and then just a few of the heading cuts rather than just all heading cuts. We want to avoid all heading cuts and only make them when we need to do that. Evergreens can be a little bit of a challenge. Sometimes, you know, people really want to see those evergreens cut back, but all their growth seems to be on the outer ends of the branches. So if you were to want to cut it back to 50% of what it was before, your chances are you're going to be looking at just sticks and woodiness. So we need to try to think a little more strategically about some of our evergreens. A lot of times we call it a hybrid approach, where we'll do thinning cuts in there, where we will take some of those larger stems and we will follow them back deeper into the plant and cut them back at their parent stem and kind of create pockets of light in the evergreen. And that way you can have sunlight get down further into the plant. But then we'll go through and we'll make heading cuts after that and kind of shape the plant to give it form. So it's that combination of those removal cuts and then the heading cuts. If you take your evergreens back too far and you don't leave enough needles, it can really stress them out. This picture on the left was something that was cut back very severely, and then over the course of the winter, it got winter burn, and the plant just couldn't stay healthy enough through the long winter, and it really got hammered there. And you can see that is nothing that anyone wants in their yard anymore. So try to avoid that sort of thing. When you're doing hedges, it's another concept to think about is to have that top tapered. There's a couple reasons for doing that. You will get more sunlight to the base of the plant if you have a tapered top. You can see how that sunlight's going to hit those bottom parts of the hedge much better. If you were to do it, a lot of times people tend to do it the wrong way where you're wider at the top. And if you're doing it, if it's wider at the top, the top of the plant tends to shade the bottom of the plant more. And the shadier it is, the thinner the tree's going to be, or the shrub's going to be. It's going to be less productive. And then also with some plants, and I can think of evergreens for the most part, if you have a tapered top, it will have less snow weight, less snow load on the top as well. You want to try to think about that, especially in a Wisconsin winter with snow and ice. The least surface area on the top, the less drag that snow is going to have to bend those branches on your evergreen. All right, so now I've got a few photos, kind of things you should not do. So we talked about, so this is kind of a recap as well, but you have a large pruning cut here. This is on a maple tree. You can see that big cut. We want to try to avoid making those large cuts when we can on a plant, because years later, this is what it looks like. You can see there's a hollowness in there. There's decay has set in. The tree tried to grow over it. You can see this is called callus growth, where that growth is trying to roll over the pruning cut, but it's never going to make it. And the decay has set in, and at some point this tree will be structurally defect, and it will have a big defect, and the tree will have to be removed because it'll be a hazard. And it can all point back to those old pruning cuts that were made. Could have been 10 years ago, could have been 15 years ago. But that's something that you should think about. These trees can't just magically heal over those big cuts. Another thing you want to avoid is tearing. So try to use the right equipment. If it's a larger limb, don't use the little hand pruners if you can't get through it and you're going to be, pushing as hard as you can on that clipper to get it to cut. You're wiggling it back and forth, trying to just get that cut. Get the handsaw. The handsaw is a better choice then. So use the proper tools. Smaller cuts are hand pruners, larger cuts, handsaw. If you're using a chainsaw, that's probably a whole nother conversation for another webinar about that. And you think about your tools. So keep them clean, keep them sharp. A lot of times you can oil them with WD-40 or something like that and clean some of the sap off, and they will cut better. That'll be a good thing. With hand pruners, the bypass pruners are a nicer style to use versus the anvil style. The anvil has like a blunt edge, and then the cutting knife comes down and it kind of crushes the stem as you're cutting it, where the bypass one, there's two knives that kind of come through. You get a better cut with the bypass style. We want to avoid topping of the tree. So topping definitely can lead to decay. So topping is similar to heading. So those heading cuts we talked about, where we're not cutting back to lateral branches, I mentioned that we really want to make those heading cuts on smaller diameter branches. If you did them to larger diameter branches, like let's say something that's 6 inches in diameter, you can have real problems, and that's what we call topping. So this stem here, I really love this picture. So this was a topping cut that was made probably, who knows, let's say 10 years ago. The tree never was able to heal over that cut. Decay started working through the stem. In the meantime, the tree had enough energy to put out these sprout branches. So these branches continue to grow. But look at the foundation of where these sprout branches are coming. This is a very thin amount of wood here. It definitely is in a weaker state. And now you can imagine a windstorm comes through, and these branches, these sprouts that have come off of these top decayed branches are just ripe for breaking. So we see these things fail all the time. So we don't want to top trees. We'd rather do crown reductions, make those cuts that way. Do side prunings, create clearance, if you're concerned about the safety. We do a lot of education of our clients about why we shouldn't top the trees. Here's another example of that lion tailing. Unfortunately, I still drive around town and see trees that are pruned like this, where they're just way overdone. totally thinned out in the center. You get wind coming, those branches are going to whip back and forth because all the weight is on the very end of the branches. Yeah, I suppose the airflow is going to go through the tree, but it's going to whip those branches violently. And as those branches grow out, they're going to droop and sag, and the tree's going to need a lot of maintenance. So unfortunately, there's a lot of people that cut trees that don't know these things and are doing it incorrectly. So we're here to change that, though. Young trees, they grow differently than old trees. We definitely can be more aggressive with our young trees. We can cut, they are growing faster, they're pushing out new growth. With young trees, we're really going to create that structure. We're going to take off branches that are competing with each other. We're going to eliminate those codominant situations. By the time we get to an older tree, the structure of that tree is set, and we're really in a more of a maintenance mode. We're pruning out dead branches. Maybe we're doing some reduction of some of the longer limbs to reduce some weight on the ends, but that's really what we want to do. We don't want to make the large cuts. We'd rather make lots of smaller cuts. It's much better for the tree. The tree grows over those cuts a lot faster. And don't take out more than you need to. Really kind of understand what cuts you're making and why you're making them. Kind of have a justification for every cut you're doing. Really think about it. And as you get more experience, you just get faster and faster at making those decisions. They happen immediately in your head as you go. I like to think about visualizing the future growth. So if you're looking at a tree, you're looking at two limbs and they're kind of growing and getting close to each other. Maybe they're starting to run parallel to each other. Think about where that tree will be in 3 to 4 years. Will those two limbs be growing into each other? Will they have started to fuse and rub on each other? If so, you might want to take one of those limbs out. Think of it that way. Think of where those structural scaffold permanent branches are going to be in the tree and make sure that they have space. Things that are going to be growing and interfering with those. It's as easy as the ABCs. Access the tree with the right equipment, remove the bad branches, and remove the competing limbs. ABC. So I think that is all I need to say about that. Making our cuts at the right spot at the branch collar is really important too. So we do not want to leave a stub. You can see where this stub is. We get sprouts that are going to grow out of there. We're going to have more chance of dieback in that stem, decay getting in there. If you go on the right side, this is more of a flush cut on the stem. Look at that surface area there. And unfortunately, this is the branch collar, and the branch collar's flying off the tree with the rest of the limb there. And so the tree doesn't have the energy response to grow over the cut. So we want to try to do our target branch collar pruning right like this one. A nice 45-degree angle, minimizing the surface area, leaving the branch collar. It's so important. That's probably the foundational thing to understand and take out of this talk today. Good cuts versus bad cuts. You can go back years later and see how a pruning cut was made and know if it was good or bad. So if it has closed over completely, a full circle, like on this tree here, that was a wonderful cut that was made. The tree is sealed over that really well. Now we go over here to this cherry tree. You can see the tree tried to grow over it, but it was a flush cut up on that top left side there. And now there is decay in there, and that tree's never going to be the same again. Trees take a long time to grow, so we want to make the proper cuts on them. I think about lawns, and if you mess up a lawn, let's say somebody accidentally put herbicide down and killed the whole lawn instead of a fertilizer, that has happened. We've never done that, but it certainly has happened before. But you can get a new lawn in a year. If you try hard enough and put the effort in, a new lawn can get established in a year. You just can't do that with trees. So we really want to think wisely about the type of cuts that we're making on our trees. Pruning paint. Pruning paint is something a lot of people still wonder if they should use. This was a big debate in our industry probably in the 70s or so. My grandfather and my father, to an extent, used pruning paint quite a bit when they were climbing in trees. They would make their cut and they would dab the pruning paint on on the pruning cut to keep out insects and diseases. Turns out that's not necessary. It never showed any scientific proof that it was keeping insects out or sealing up the wounds better. So in matter of fact, some cases there was arguments that it was making it worse. It was trapping moisture. And that could be a problem. So we really, this is something that we really don't do in our industry anymore. You can still commonly buy pruning sealer in a lot of different places. Some arguments can still be made nowadays for when you're pruning elm trees or you're pruning oak trees. And if you have to prune those trees in the growing season, some people will use paint. You want to avoid pruning oaks and elms in the growing season because each of those trees has diseases that are carried by insects that are attracted to pruning cuts. So if your oak wilt can occur if the oak beetle comes to your tree that you freshly pruned in the middle of June and can spread the fungal spores. Likewise, the beetle that carries Dutch elm disease can do the same thing. So pruning paint might be able to keep those insects out. But the better idea is to not prune those trees in the growing season, oaks and elms, unless it's something that just cannot be avoided. When to prune is a very common question. It really depends. The timing of your pruning depends on, I guess, what your goals are going to be. So if you're doing a really aggressive pruning where you may be stressing the tree out, remember I told you the leaves are all food factory. So if you were to aggressively prune back a tree in like June, right after it's put all its energy into pushing out its leaves, and then you come through and you cut most of these leaves off, the tree never was able to recoup its investment, right? It pushed all that growth out. It used up all its energy to reserve to get the leaves out, and then you've cut them all back. That could be traumatic for a tree. So if you're going to be doing a more aggressive pruning, probably better off doing that in the dormancy season. Conversely, though, sometimes in the winter, those cuts the tree's not actively growing. So some of those pruning cuts can take a little longer to grow over. So they might linger a little longer than if you made those cuts in the spring or summer. So maybe that's an aesthetic reason. Maybe you don't want to see the pruning cuts. So you would do them in the spring or summer. Sometimes heading cuts in the later summer or some of the thinning cuts might, if you're doing that, again, late summer, you might encourage new growth. That new growth might not harden off before winter. So you might want to be concerned about that. A lot of times, especially if you're doing aggressive pruning. But really, any good thinning cuts for most trees can be done at any time of the year. So, like those removal cuts we talked about, we do those all throughout the season. We're not really impacting flowering. And that's the one, I guess that's the other thing to talk about too, is what you do. A lot of times if you're pruning your shrubs in the wrong time of year, you might be cutting off flower buds and then you won't get as many blossoms in the next year. So the real concept with that is the best time to prune a flowering shrub is shortly after it has blossomed, because that way you're not cutting off new buds. So you get it, your lilacs are blossoming in May, so you come in June and you thin out the lilacs or shape back, make reduction cuts. One thing to remember, you're not really impacting the flowering if you're making removal cuts. It's really those reduction cuts that are going to be the ones that are going to impact flowering. If you've reduced the entire canopy, you could have cut off all the flowering buds. Versus if you're thinning by doing removal cuts, you're still leaving some of those end branches that contain the blossoms. Training young trees, this is one of our most favorite activities to do, is really because every tree is like a different puzzle and you can really look at it and figure out how you would do it. And there's not always a right answer with this. So here you can see reduction cuts are made. This big limb here was definitely competing. This limb was larger than the center limb. So we want to slow that limb down, allow the center one to grow and develop and to be the dominant limb. So considerable amount, 2/3 of that limb was removed. Over here on the other side, you can see another reduction cut, another big reduction cut that was 2/3 of that branch was taken off. And then on the back side of a tree, yet another one. So this tree essentially had 4 different stems, all vying to be the supreme dominant stem of the tree. And now we have definitely made this tree more organized, and the central leader is now going to be the strong leader of the tree. Here's another example where we've made some cuts to create that central leader. Now, when you're doing this on a young tree, you may, when you make some cuts, it may create some holes in the canopy a little bit. It might, aesthetically, you might question it. Like, was that the right thing? I've lost some of this beautiful form of the tree. The tree will grow rapidly. The tree will grow and fill into those spaces. It's better to set the right structure and allow that tree to develop. Have some patience with your trees when you do that. Here's some real life examples. We went with, on the right side, we got 1, 2, 3 main stems. You can see what's happened. They were shortened with reduction cuts. We were left with 1 stem in the center of the tree. Here's a good example of what it looks like after some light pruning or moderate to heavy pruning. So we have our ABC, our 3 codominant competing leaders. In the middle one, we have done reduction cuts. We've cut those back. Still lots of tree remaining here, but you can see with our third picture that this was definitely more aggressively done. There's some more removal cuts going on onto this one. Depending on the species and the age, you can get more aggressive. I think one of our things that we talk with some of our young arborists when they first come on is to not be afraid with some of these younger trees to be a little more aggressive, because if you don't prune back, if you're reducing some of the codominant branches or stems, but you don't do it enough, the tree will just outgrow it and it'll look like you didn't make an impact. So sometimes you need to understand that and have a little more courage and be a little more aggressive. The keys to the structural pruning of the trees is remove the dead and the disease, the rubbing and the interfering branches, and really create that desired structure with the dominant leader, get those good permanent scaffold branches going, and then remove those other branches that are going to be considered temporary branches that are going to be competing with those stems. Here's a tree that's very thick. You can see what has been done here with this crown cleaning. We've been able to thin that tree out, better airflow. Those limbs are going to be more productive. It still looks very full, very natural. And if you look on the ground, you can see that there was a lot of branches left over. So a lot was pruned out of the tree, but it doesn't really look like it. It's a nice sight to see. This is what I've always enjoyed, this picture here too. So when the leaves are off, you can really define, you can really see the structure of the tree. That's why we like to do a lot of pruning in the wintertime. So if you need your trees pruned, now's a great time to call us, because we can get in there quicker and do the job. But you can see this tree was topped at some point. Right about in here was where it was cut back. And then all these sprouts came up. So they're very thick. They're competing with each other. Now you can look on the right and you can see how many of those branches were thinned out. It's created more structure to the tree. These limbs that are remaining are more productive. This is something that kind of dives into the crown restoration idea, where you're restoring a tree after, maybe a poor pruning practice was done to it. Here's another good example. Multiple leaders, multiple stems on the tree. We prune them, many of them out. We've created much better space. These stems have room to grow and to be better. Crown thinning, we've talked about that. That's where we're creating better airflow. We're getting branches removed so that what's left is going to be more productive. We're reducing diseases, fungicide diseases, by that airflow and more sunlight. You can see how aggressive some of that can look on a tree canopy. We do thinning on evergreens as well. Look at how nice this Scotch pine can turn out after all this dead stuff and rubbing branches were removed. We have a crabapple tree here. The clarity of these resolution isn't the best on these photos, but you can really see how, if you thin it out, you can really see the beautiful structure and architecture of those limbs and cascading, weeping nature of this crabapple tree. So it's really helping bring out the character of the tree by pruning it, and it's going to be healthier. It's going to have less apple scab disease when you do that. All right, that is the end of our presentation. I'll stop sharing here. I will open this up for questions now. We'll see what we have in the chat. I'll review those. Feel free to put questions in the chat. I'll stick around for a while afterwards. This will be posted on our website, back on the event section of our website in the future, in the next day or two here, so you can view it on demand if you'd like. But I appreciate your time, everyone, and thank you for listening. And let's see what questions we have. All right.